like to welcome everybody to another one of our joint scheduled sessions. This is both an O'Neill conversation series that the O'Neill School has been having occasionally over the last few months. And the focus is on some of the things to expect out of the new administration in the first 100 days. This is also co-scheduled with the Civic Leaders Center. And if any of you have joined us who are not a member of the Civic Leaders Center, it's a program for first-year students at IU from all majors, but overseen by the O'Neill School, where the students live in Briscoe, and they've just returned to Briscoe after 11 and a half weeks back in their, presumably in their hometowns or away from Bloomington. So it's good to have everybody back in Briscoe. But again, busy day in DC with the impeachment. We're not talking about impeachment though. We're talking about what the new administration is hoping to do, primarily in some of the transportation and economics spending areas. And we've got two guests who are going to be joining us, and I'll have them introduce themselves in a little more detail. Donna McLean and Brad Heim. And Donna joins us from Washington, D.C., and she'll give you a little of her background. But for a lot of you students, Donna is a great person to get to know because she is the director of the O'Neill Washington Leadership Program. And so if that's something you're interested in the future, Donna is somebody that you'd be dealing with when you're in Washington. But Donna, let's turn it over to you for some of your observations on introduce yourself first, and then some of the observations on what you see coming perhaps in the first 100 days in the areas of transportation and in finances too.
Great. Okay. Thanks. Appreciate being invited. I'm impressed. It's a very large group to keep entertained. So I hope I will. And if any of you have cats, I hope to see them show up on the screen. Just keep me entertained. Okay. So my background real quick is I graduated from O'Neill School back when it was SPIA with a master's degree, was a presidential management fellow, and went to work at OMB, which is a career position. Then I worked on Capitol Hill on the House Aviation Subcommittee. Then I worked as the CFO at FAA, the Chief Financial Officer. Then I became the Assistant Secretary for Budget and Programs at the Department of Transportation, which is a Senate confirmed position. So I went from sort of a career position to a political position. And then that was about 15 years of my career, really fast, told you there. My husband was in the administration as well. And we looked around and said, oh my gosh, is anybody taking care of the kids? So finally, I decided, okay, I'm going to try to do something different because this is working in a high position in the government. It's too crazy. So I decided to be a consultant on transportation issues. And I also, like you just heard, am the professor for the Washington Leadership Program. So I'm starting my 17th year of that, which is kind of mind-blowing to me. But anyway, so most of my, also I was on the board of Amtrak, which is another Senate confirmed position. And I was a first female chair of the board of Amtrak. So I'm mostly focused on transportation policy for my entire career. So what about the first 100 days in the Biden administration? Well, we are really excited as a transportation industry that we have Secretary Buttigieg. As you know, Mayor Pete has been pretty popular in lots of different parts of the country during his campaign. And there was a lot of speculation, where was he going to land? And honestly, none of us in transportation thought he would land in transportation because he doesn't really have a transportation background. But as an industry, we're very excited because clearly he has, this is probably even though he doesn't really have a transportation background, transportation is one of the pieces of a mayor's job. But this is the first time in recent history that we've had a Secretary of Transportation that is clearly interested in higher political position. So why is that important? Well, because he's going to basically use transportation policy to sort of paint his political future. So we're going to see some pretty interesting policies, I think, be developed from the transportation stage. He's also everybody. I mean, if you have been living under a rock, you might not know, but he's been on every talk show in the last week that you can imagine. Everybody wants to have Mayor Pete. Anywhere from the late night shows to the Sunday political shows. So anyway, so what is the transportation first 100 days? Well, I kind of think there's two. I'm going to kind of divide it into two areas. One is the area of executive branch actions that don't require statutory changes. And then policies that do require statutory changes. So we need to have Congress to take action. So let's just kind of divide the out of the box first transportation policies in those two categories. Starting with the executive activities, right out of the box, transportation came out with a mask mandate, right, for travel. And that seems pretty easy. What's a big deal? Executive order, write executive order, wear a mask on all modes of transportation, done. But it's more complicated than that. Obviously, there has to be health guidelines considered. So CDC was involved, TSA was involved, the Transportation Security Administration, and then of course the Federal Aviation Administration, and all the other modes of transportation that have to deal with implementing a mask. And the federal government can't just say wear a mask. They kind of have to have a hook. They have to have the authority to require that. And so in the world of aviation, the hook to wear a mask is, in fact, there's existing law that says you cannot disrupt flights. And in fact, if you do, that you can be arrested and you can have it's a federal charge. So if you are refusing to wear a mask on a plane, but you don't get into a big, huge fight, there's really not a hook for FAA to charge you. But a lot of times, if you're not wearing a mask, one of your fellow passengers will probably flip out, which is what we've seen in all the videos, right, that have gone viral. And if there's any sort of disruption, you're probably going to be disrupting the flight. So FAA will hook you're not wearing a mask, and therefore you're disrupting a flight, and therefore we can charge you for it. So anyway, so the mask mandate has been complicated, but probably took 10 more days than expected to be released, but that was sort of right out of the box. One of the things that the Biden administration did. Second piece was right out of the box was again, executive mandate requiring that COVID tests be taken before you enter or return to the United States. And that required a lot of coordination with international airlines, domestic airlines. As you know, transportation has been hit incredibly hard during COVID. The airline industry, right at the beginning of COVID, their number of passengers declined by 80%. That's just not even a sustainable number for a industry to have an 80% decline in their revenues or passengers. So when there was discussions about having a COVID test be required before you return to the United States on a flight, bookings went down immediately by a third. So you can imagine the international airlines were very concerned about, okay, how do we implement this? The U.S. carriers and international carriers were very concerned about how we implement this and what are the long-term implications. There's been recent conversations about whether or not there should be domestic tests. So in other words, before you get on a domestic flight, you'd have to take a test as well. But the airlines believe that even the labor groups are fighting that. The airlines have said if a domestic COVID test requirement, so you couldn't fly unless you took a COVID test domestically, if that was put in place, you could easily see at least two major airlines file for bankruptcy. The labor unions are saying, are against it as well. And that's pretty unusual because the flight attendants are very supportive of mask use, but they realize that the cumbersome part of a requirement for a domestic testing for a COVID test would just be overwhelming. The other piece is it fair? I mean, why would we be testing domestically for airline travel when we're not testing for train travel or transit or getting on a bus? None of those travel modes are the government is requiring a test. So I think you'll see some more discussion about that, but I don't think that the administration is going to require that. And then the next thing is going to be what's travel going to look like post vaccines. And I was just on a listening section with Secretary Buttigieg this afternoon, and the International Airline Association was asking, what is the United States going to do about flight requirements post-COVID, or excuse me, post-vaccines. And I mean, I think you've probably heard of a vaccine passport or something like that. So the question is the federal government going to require you to show that you've been vaccinated to fly internationally, or for anybody to come into the United States? And this director from this international airline group was saying, whatever the US does, we're going to see a lot of other countries do as well. So they were anxious to have the US take a position on that. So that's, some of the executive branch. And then statutorily, there is a piece in the 1.9 trillion Rescue Act that the President Biden is pushing for aviation and transit. Aviation, the airlines have basically come out together and said, if we don't get additional relief money in the $1.9 trillion bill, we are going to see probably 27,000 employees get laid off by the end of March. So although the $1.9 trillion package isn't totally pulled together yet, identified all the pieces, it looks like there'll be about $14 billion for the airlines. And the transit industry is saying that they need 40 billion. They've already received 40 billion in past COVID packages. They need another 40 billion to get through the next 2 years. So it's likely we're going to see around 14 billion as well for transit. So that's all within the 100 days. You've obviously heard probably about infrastructure bills being something that the Biden administration is interested in. And I'm over my time, I think. It looks like it'll probably be an infrastructure bill. May have to wait until the fall, because the rumor is that an infrastructure bill, so investments in highways and transit and airlines, that kind of bill is probably not going to happen without a tax increase. And the likelihood of a tax increase going anywhere while we're still crawling out of this COVID world is highly unlikely. So the kind of rumor, which I think is a pretty big rumor, so I think they're kind of testing it, seeing what people think, is what if we don't have an infrastructure bill until the fall and we pair it with a tax? How would that go over? So that's kind of the, and we could talk a little bit more with Q&A about what kind of environmental issues might be folded into transportation bills, climate change issues that are going to be connected to transportation. And we could maybe cover that in Q&A.
Yeah. Great overview. Thanks, Donna. That covers a lot of territory, a lot of things that need to be done. Brad Heim, Brad, why don't you introduce yourself? Brad is the one thing I mentioned. He's the is the dean for the Bloomington version of the O'Neill School, executive associate dean for Bloomington. And I'll let you do the rest of your introduction. But obviously, Donna talked about a lot of spending, so you might have some comments about that. Go ahead, Brad.
All right, thanks, Paul, and welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us. So as Paul mentioned, I'm the executive associate dean for the O'Neill School on the Bloomington campus. That's kind of a recent thing for me. Before that, I'm a professor that teaches public finance classes and economics classes. My background is in economics. That's what my PhD is in. But before that, and before I came to the O'Neill School, I worked at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. I was a financial economist in the Office of Tax Analysis. So I was one of the career staff, like Donna mentioned early in her career. The office that I worked in analyzed any sort of tax change that was being considered by the presidential administration. So I was there from 2006 through 2010. The last time there was a transition with economic turmoil going around on at the same time. And so a lot of the issues that we're kind of seeing right now in the kind of policies being proposed I was involved in the analysis of those back when I was at the Treasury Department. So Donna mentioned the $1.9 trillion package that's being proposed by the Obama administration. Much of that involves the Treasury Department in some way, shape, or form. One of the big things that's getting play right now are stimulus checks. Actually, before I get into kind of the contents of the bill, I think it's good to talk a little bit about a framework to evaluate a bill like this, to kind of get a sense as to whether it makes sense or what parts make sense, and so on. And so I think two things you want to look at when you're evaluating a big relief bill or spending bill are, the first thing you want to look at is what's the goal of the bill. So is the point of the bill or the point of the provision relief, or is the point of the bill or provision stimulus? Because the way you want to structure things, if you're trying to make people whole after they've experienced a loss, oftentimes will be very different from how you want to structure things if you're trying to get people to do things, be more economically active, spend more, and so on. And so, in the popular press, this bill goes by, people will call it the stimulus bill, but then other people will call it the relief bill. And I think one thing that needs to be kept in mind is what you're really trying to do. Is it relief or is it stimulus? The second thing, and this, so there are kind of 3 T's you want to use to evaluate a bill like this. So the first T you want to evaluate is it timely? So whether you're trying to do stimulus or relief, is the money going to get out when the money is needed? If the money is going to get out way after it's needed, a lot of times it'll do more harm than good. So you want it to be timely. The second thing is you want it to be targeted. So you want whatever provisions to go toward the people that you're trying to help or the people that you're trying to influence. And if you target it wrong, you may end up spending money on doing not much of any good. And then the third thing you want to look at is it temporary? There are certain things that the government might want to do when times are bad that you wouldn't necessarily want to continue forever. Because there can be bad incentive effects down the road, if you continually do the same thing. Okay, so those are the kind of the 2 things. So are we talking relief? Are we talking stimulus? And then is it timely, targeted, and temporary? Okay, so looking at the proposal that's out there right now, so of the $1.9 million, 400 billion of it is kind of earmarked toward pandemic response, things like funding for vaccination programs, testing, school funding. I think those pieces. It's clearly a relief provisions and timely, targeted, and temporary, and so those kind of pass muster. The second group, there's about $1 trillion in cash relief in the proposal. A lot of play has been made out of the stimulus checks, and I think we could talk more about the stimulus checks. There have already been 2 rounds of stimulus checks or kind of cash payments. The first round was in March and April. So individuals got $1,200, married couples got $2,400, and $500 per kid. Now it phases out at higher income ranges, and the reason why they do that, has generally been that if you're trying to craft a stimulus, higher income people tend not to spend much of the money. And so if what you're trying to do is get people to spend the money, you want to target it toward lower income levels. But there still is a question here: is what we're trying to do is stimulate, or is what we're trying to do provide relief? Because if we're trying to provide relief, the pandemic has been unusual in that people even at very high income levels have gotten hit hard, losing businesses or losing jobs and so on. And so income phase outs like that, kind of are kind of a rough tool to use for targeting. The other thing that we found out, from the last couple rounds of cash payments have been that, unlike back in 2008 when I was in the Treasury Department and we sent out cash checks when about 2/3 of the money was spent right away, that hasn't been what's happening with these cash payments. So these cash payments have been very sticky. They go out to bank accounts that accounts at credit unions, and a lot of them have been sticking there. And why is that? Well, some people aren't spending because they don't have money. Other people aren't spending because of the environment that we're operating in right now. And so with each subsequent set of stimulus checks that have gone out, this has been kind of a cash influx for the deposits in the banking sector. And so normal year deposits might go up by 3%, 4% or so. Last year, they went up by 20%, which is a huge increase and causes kind of downstream effects in the economy. So, so that's one concern I have in kind of looking at the stimulus checks that are being proposed now, which is essentially another $1,400 targeted the same way. I'm not convinced that that's the way we want to structure this. There's an extension of unemployment insurance in the package, and I can get into that a little more in the Q&A if people are interested. That's a more targeted way of hitting people who have been affected by the pandemic. So you lose your job, you're receiving unemployment insurance, clearly you've been affected. And so if you're trying to do a relief measure, that might be a provision that you want to focus on. There's about $400 billion for governments and small businesses. That's kind of a mixed bag, and we can talk about that later in the Q&A. And then on top of that, there are some additional provisions that have been stapled on that I think it's relatively easy to argue that this is these aren't so related to the pandemic per se, and they probably shouldn't be thought of as relief or as stimulus. So one of the big provisions that's being proposed is a big expansion of the child tax credit and making that refundable. There's a minimum wage increase that's been included in the proposal. Just today, I saw there was an Affordable Care Act expansion that's being considered to be included in the proposal. And so now we're starting to get kind of further and further away, from either relief or stimulus. Anyone that kind of follows DC knows that happens all the time, that, congressmen see the train leaving the station, senators see this is the vehicle that I can use to pass what I want to pass. And so it's now or never. So let's staple it onto that bill. And so that's not surprising that those have been included. Republicans have countered, Republicans in the Senate have countered with a $600 billion package. The downside for Republicans is that they don't have the votes. So when you don't have the votes, you don't have much of a bargaining chip. If the Biden administration decides to go forward with the bigger stimulus or the relief package, Republicans are put in a hard place because they might have wanted a smaller package, but then the question is, do they really want to vote against the next relief package? And that might be politically difficult for them to do. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to the questions.
Right, and if you've got questions, there's two ways we can take questions. You can send a chat to Becky Rosen with your question, or you can raise your hand, and I'll try to keep track of whose hands have been raised first. Just before we get into the questions, and you can start raising your hands and sending those chats. And this ties into both of your comments. One of the discussions going on now is whether this is going to be a bipartisan bill or whether it's going to be an attempt to use reconciliation where you don't really need bipartisan support. Donna, do you want to just comment on the process a little bit so we're all on the same page? What do you how would it work and what do you expect?
Sure. If you've been following the $1.9 trillion bill, you probably been hearing about this reconciliation process and that the Senate's going to use the reconciliation process. And this special process allows that the vote only has to be 51 or the majority to get it passed. So let's back up for just a second and think about how does the Senate actually function. And when the Senate typically passes a bill, there's actually a kind of a two-step process. And the first step is they have to vote for cloture, which cuts off the filibuster, and then they actually vote for the bill. So this is part of the Senate rules, and both the House and the Senate, every Congress, they pass a collection of rules that they abide by. So again, in the Senate rules require for most bills for you to first vote have a cloture vote, which kind of identifies we're going to close the filibuster and we're going to start the traditional debate process. And that cloture vote requires 60 votes. And then the second vote is actually just the vote on the bill. So by removing the filibuster, you're removing that first step in the traditional Senate rules on passing a bill. So that's the kind of debate about removing the filibuster and why that would be advantageous to a Democrat-controlled Senate that only has, the very slim majority, 50 senators and plus a vice president. So that's there are some bills, however, that have privilege, and that means that they actually get to skip that first part, that first cloture vote, which takes 60 votes, and they can go directly to the second part of the vote, and all they need is a simple majority to pass. And the budget process has, the Budget Control Act does say that the budget reconciliation has that privilege. The thing is, the budget process happens once a year. So there's only one time in a year you get this reconciliation process. And so one time a year you get this sort of ability to put together a package. It has to be budget, because Senate rules say it has to be has to have a spending or a budgetary impact. And then that bill would be privileged and only need a majority vote. But here's the other trick. We're actually for the so the Democrats are saying we want to push the $1.9 trillion budget through timely, as Brad was saying. So you would use this accelerated process that you do not have to have any Republicans join on, because you can just have all the Democrats vote and get this bill passed, because it's the reconciliation bill. So you're using the budget process, which means it's privileged, which means you don't have to get a 60 vote majority to remove the threat of a filibuster. And you can go directly to the vote. But the crazy thing is, this filibuster is actually last year's filibuster. So, this reconciliation is actually last year's reconciliation. So we could have 2 reconciliation bills this year, which is pretty unusual. I hope that explained sort of why the reconciliation process is as briefly as possible.
Good job. Brad, anything to add there before we go to questions?
No.
Okay, let's go. Will Kelly's got his hand up first.
My name is Will Kelly. I'm a freshman in the O'Neill School studying law and public policy, and my question's a little bit long. But so to circle back to infrastructure, I was wondering if the panelists, particularly Professor McLean, could speak to what you expect the parameters of that bill to be, and whether you expect it to be done with that second reconciliation bill, or will there be sort of a train leaving the station thing where there's a lot of political, like everybody's gung-ho to do infrastructure, so you might not even need to do it through reconciliation. I was also wondering if you could expand on the comment about the timeline for infrastructure being this fall. I was under the impression that the Biden administration was planning to roll out their plan in like the joint address to Congress, which is happening soonish. But I know like the Larry Summers op-ed was the big thing last week, and that his concerns about the stimulus leaving less room to deficit spend on infrastructure are shared by a lot of people. So I was just wondering if you could speak to like whether it's like primarily coming from that line of thought with the Summers op-ed, or if there's other reasons that they're thinking that they might want to wait until fall to do.
Yeah, okay, great question, Will. All right, so I've tried to take notes and hopefully I'll hit everything. Let me know if I missed something. All right, so back on the sort of putting it in perspective. So our current, does anybody know what our current debt is? Anybody?
Isn't it 27.9 or something?
Ooh, who's been looking at the clock lately? The debt clock. Is that Lizzie? Is that how you say your name?
Yes.
Hi. Okay. Yeah. So say it again, Lizzie, loud and proud.
$27.9 trillion.
Wow, trillion, big T, trillion. That's incredible. Then that means that every taxpayer is responsible for paying $222,000. That's mind blowing. So that's where we are today. Before we even start, that's before we spend the $1.9 trillion on the rescue plan, and before we even start talking about spending money on infrastructure spending. So we got here for a lot of reasons, and we don't even have time to talk about how we got here, but we are here. So you're right, Will. The Biden administration said, hey, we're doing the infrastructure investments quickly. But just as Brad was talking about, are you trying to make people whole because of a loss, or are you trying to stimulate the economy? Infrastructure investments tend to be a stimulant, that's the purpose of it. But transportation spending to date has been just to keep the doors open on our transit systems, our airlines, it's keeping people employed. So we've spent quite a bit on infrastructure, just keeping it in place up to this point. So any kind of infrastructure bill that we do, the question is, well, is it about time that users actually start paying for it? We haven't had an increase in the tax, gas tax, since I think right before the Father Bush lost his election. It was basically during his tenure that we had an increase in the gas tax. And of course, we're trying to fade out gas tax anyway. So there's already been signals during Secretary Buttigieg's confirmation hearing. He mentioned something about, well, we might be considering a tax increase, and he had to walk back that comment within hours. So I'm not sure we're going to be able to see big infrastructure spending without acknowledging that our taxes aren't matching our appetite for infrastructure spending. However, I can't imagine that people are going to have the appetite for a tax increase or any kind of, taxes while we're in this COVID recession. So what does that mean? I think that is the pull that infrastructure has had for decades. Infrastructure bills have had for decades. Is we believe that it helps stimulate the economy. We believe it's an investment in our future, but do we have the money really to do it? And so I think that's why there's been some quiet kind of conversations that what happens if maybe we do this in the fall? Would everybody be okay with that? Or is that a bad idea? So I think the kind of rumors are an attempt to sort of test the waters on, can we wait? Now the highway programs, they expire, their reauthorization expires at the end of this fiscal year, which is, October 1, basically. So that has to be passed one way or another, but we're on a 1-year extension. But the highway reauthorization, surface reauthorization, often gets people talking infrastructure in and of itself. So I'm sure we're going to hear a ton about infrastructure, and I think that it's still really up in the air on when we're going to see a bill. And I wouldn't put money on the next, 6 weeks to October. That's how big my guess is right now because of the uncertainty of the COVID economy.
I've been waiting for infrastructure week since I was mayor, and that was 25 years ago. So
there you go. Okay.
Brad, anything to add on that? Let's move on to Lizzie. Lizzie, who got that, who knows her debt real well.
Yeah, so my name is Lizzie Strawn. I am a freshman here at IU studying environmental management. And my question is for Brad Heim. And I was wondering, so you did say, you were mentioning like, is it a relief package or is it a stimulus package? And so you kind of just like jumped around. I was wondering what actually you believe the Biden administration is actually going to be passing. Will it be relief or will it be stimulus?
it's a great question, and I think in the end, it probably will be a combination that they're going for. And because different provisions tend to do different things. I think ultimately most of it will be more of a relief package than a stimulus package. Unfortunately, I think particularly for the stimulus checks, I think now is not a great time to be trying to stimulate through checks. I think a better option would be try to use those payments as more of a relief. The kind of logistical difficulty in doing that, has to do with the IRS and what they can and can't do. So ideally, if the checks were meant as relief, what you would want to do is try to identify people whose income has gone down over the past year and try to make them whole, or at least make them closer to whole. And theoretically, you can do that. The problem is kind of a timing thing. So can you make it timely? So for example, you could look at people's tax returns from 2020 and compare them to their tax returns from 2019, see if their income went down, and then target your payments based on kind of changes from year to year. So that's one thing you could do. Another thing you could do is you could try to target it to people, based on their 2020 income. So because 2019 income, that was pre-pandemic, and you don't necessarily, how people were doing pre-pandemic doesn't necessarily match how they're doing now. The problem that you face in trying to target in that way is that tax filing season is right now, and right now is when people are filing tax returns for 2020, and they don't have to file them until April 15th. And if you get an extension, you get until October 15th. And so the government doesn't necessarily know until, much later in the year, how people did in 2020 even. And so the last two rounds of checks were based off of 2019 income. And, unless they wait a while, this, kind of current round will end up being based off of 2019 income too. And so as a result, anything kind of done in that sphere, even if they wanted to make it more of a relief package, it's going to be poorly targeted, because what they would need to use to target it, ultimately wouldn't, they won't have the information. So then the hope might be, okay, maybe this becomes a stimulus, so at least we get some, economic activity out of it. The downside is that, in this environment, these payments don't seem to stimulate much. And so for those payments, we're in kind of a, worst of both worlds type of situation. We'd like to give relief. We can't. We'd hope it would be stimulus. It doesn't seem to be.
Great. Let's go to Jackson for a question.
Hello, my name is Jackson Bell. I am a freshman law and public policy major from Fishers, Indiana. And my question is more generally about Biden's first 100 days of economics outside of this bill, although I don't know how much there will be outside of this bill, but in regards to organized labor. So I'd be interested to hear from our guests how much they think that unions and organized labor in general will come to play in Biden's economic plan during his 4 years.
Donna, you want to jump in on that?
Yeah. So labor is a big part of transportation. I mean, we've got pilots, we've got, flight attendants, we've got all of Amtrak is unionized. The FAA has air traffic controllers that are unionized. So unionization in transportation is like, sort of where unions originally came from is, some of the transportation unions. So they've been around a long time. And you're right. I'll say that as soon as Biden won, the world of Washington begins churning on, okay, who's going to be in what position and who's going to move. And everybody basically said, if you want to know who's going to be put in positions, call the two guys at the AFL-CIO who are the transportation union guys, and they're going to tell you, they're going to know. So you're absolutely right. The reputation is that the unions play a very strong role in the administration. With that being said, I think that, oh, and then the other thing I was going to say, the House Transportation Committee just had a hearing, and it was the first hearing of the Congress, and they invited union reps to basically come and testify and tell them what their priorities should be for the year. So in the world of transportation, we will be listening to unions absolutely 100%. The interesting thing I think will be is when the unions desires and expectations perhaps don't coincide with other strong policies that the Biden administration are expressing, including environmental issues that help to reduce climate and climate change and environmental issues, obviously, and I don't think racial equity issues will particularly be inconsistent with unions, but it'll be interesting to see how that plays out as well, because that's a very, prominent topic for and goal for the Biden administration as well. Brad, do you have anything to add on that one?
No, yeah, I guess the other thing, I think what Donna mentioned for the transportation sector kind of is true throughout the Biden administration. I think labor is going to have much more of a seat at the table than than they have had during the Trump administration, or generally have during Republican administrations.
I don't know if this is one of the priorities for the unions, but I know a couple of students sent in questions before we started about, and you touched on it just briefly, Brad, on the $15 minimum wage push. Is that I mean, whether that's coming from the unions or just from other groups, is that something you see becoming part of the rollout? And if it is, is that what's that going to do to inflation or struggling businesses? Just briefly on a minimum wage hike like that.
Sure. So I think part of the answer to that kind of circles back to what Donna was talking about the reconciliation process, because one of the rules of the reconciliation process is that, any provisions in the bill have to have revenue, revenue impacts and be generally kind of tightly tied to the budget. I think there's an open question, and Donna can probably correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's an open question whether a minimum wage increase could be passed through the reconciliation process. My guess would be no, but Donna, do you?
Yeah, so in fact, actually, the president mentioned this on Sunday in his interview that I can't even remember where it was, but he's basically said, I don't think we're going to get the $15 minimum wage in the $1.9 trillion rescue package because the parliamentarian is going to strike it out. But, what does a normal person, like, who is the parliamentarian and who voted for him? Well, the parliamentarian is basically the person in Congress. There's one in the House and the Senate, and they basically make legal declaring our interpretations of the House and Senate rules is what the parliamentarian does. So it is a very unique role for a lawyer. Often that parliamentarian doesn't change when the Republicans control the House versus the Democrats, because it's not really seen as a particularly partisan or political role. It's just really like, pencil focused lawyer role of how do the rules apply to a law. Every bill that's introduced in the House or Senate, the parliamentarian looks at it and says, okay, what committee has jurisdiction over this bill? And then they assign it to the committees that have jurisdiction for consideration. So that's the role of the parliamentarian. But they also then, in this case, if there's a question about whether or not there is a provision that is consistent with the rules, the parliamentarian says either yay or nay. So, but the interesting thing is, the parliamentarian can make a rule, like they can say, okay, I don't believe that the $15 minimum wage can be part of the reconciliation bill because it doesn't impact the revenues or spending. Therefore, it is not considered a spending bill. It's not part of can't be part of a reconciliation package. So that parliamentarian can make that ruling, but then the Senate majority leader can overrule the parliamentarian. So there is, it's still kind of a little unknown. So we'll see how that all plays out.
It's just from a policy or political side, do you see it moving or not moving?
The $15 minimum
Yeah.
wage? Well, I think the very interesting, there's this very recent CBO, Congressional Budget Office report that came out. And if you're looking for any organization that is as apolitical as possible, the Congressional Budget Office, I think, fits the bill. It is part of the legislative branch, but it works for both Republicans and Democrats. And they came out with a bill, with a evaluation of $15 minimum wage bill that said, congratulations, you will pull 900,000 people out of poverty with a $15 minimum wage, but you'll also have 1.4 million people lose their job. So that's been pretty eye-opening.
Yeah, my guess would be the minimum wage piece ends up getting pulled out of the package, and it's considered kind of later on. I think it's it's more of a stretch to claim that that's part of COVID relief rather than another policy policy goal. And yeah, that CBO report said, so the nice thing about a $15 minimum wage is that for economists that study these things, we actually have some good data on what the impacts are, because Seattle did an experiment, or was kind of a natural experiment, where they passed a $15 minimum wage, and it was studied really extensively to see what are the impacts on incomes, what are the impacts on employment, and so Seattle was used as kind of an experimental laboratory, and that's what the CBO ultimately can point to as the experience that we have with this. So yeah, my guess is that ends up getting pulled out and is considered another day.
Let's go to Ethan Iverson.
Hello, my name is Ethan Iverson. I'm studying environmental management. My question is for you, Donna. So my first question is, it's Amtrak's 50th year this year, and kind of in the last 50 years, I feel like the system as a whole has kind of been allowed to survive and not to thrive. Outside the Northeast corridor, we haven't really seen a lot of federal investment in the system. It's been mostly state governments that have invested in their own corridors and routes. So do you think Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg's appetite for investment in passenger rail, do you think this is finally kind of a turning point for the system as a whole, or not? And then also, I'd love to hear about your time on the Amtrak Board of Directors and what it was like and what were your duties on it.
Yeah. Thanks for the question, Evan. Ethan, sorry. Yeah, absolutely. Joe, Secretary, President Biden, when he was senator, he would travel on Amtrak from Delaware to DC. And so he was known as Joe Amtrak. And in fact, I have, when I was chairman of the board of Amtrak, the president was vice president, and I had to introduce him because he came to give the $9 billion worth of stimulus funds that was in the one of the stimulus bills, that probably Brad worked on. He was, announcing it at Amtrak. And so I have a picture of him with his hands on both of my shoulders, like looking at me, smiling. But it was what he was basically saying with a smile on his face was, "You're not going to close Beech Grove is that in Indiana, right? Yeah, you're not going to close Beech Grove maintenance facility, are you?" Yeah, we weren't, but it was one of those, I'm acting like I'm chummy with you, but I'm really telling you what you won't be doing. Anyway, he is already known as a trainiac, as we like to say. So I suspect he'll make sure there's more money headed to Amtrak. And like I said, Secretary Buttigieg has already shown up on the Amtrak platform to make one of his first speeches. I think he's enamored with it. The thing is that Secretary Buttigieg may not have seen is the price tag to have train travel. And that's why we really haven't seen Amtrak flourish in this country, is because of the price tag of trains. There's and of course, in our effort to increase travel that is sustainable, you want electric trains, and electric trains are even more expensive. And we only really have electrification on the Northeast corridor. And you're not going to get fast trains unless they're electrified. And so the catenaries that are above the trains to get trains to, get electricity, that is a huge, huge investment. And the reason you see trains be so successful in Europe is because it's a very consolidated space. And so the Northeast corridor is a very consolidated, heavily populated corridor. And so it's quite successful. I think let me just say one thing about transportation, then I'll stop talking because somebody else might have a question here. But Ethan, if you ever want to chat trains, I'm always happy to chat trains. Anyway, we are seeing incredible evolution in transportation. And I think we now more than ever have to stop thinking about one mode at a time. Like, I like trains, I want more trains. Transportation is a system of options for travel, and it's a network, and that's how we have to look at it. So we can't, like, when you wake up in the morning, you don't go like, I'm headed to Indy in my car. You're just headed to Indy. You happen to be driving. If you were taking a train, you wouldn't wake up in the morning and say, I'm riding a train. No, you're headed to Indy via a train, right? So we've got to think about transportation as a network, and therefore we can't say, hey, we should have trains like that country has, because like our freight train industry in this country is 20 times better than any other country's freight train system. So, but we are a very, big country. So aviation travel is much more reasonable for cross-country travel. It would take you multiple days to get across country on a train. And that's not true for most European countries, right? You can ride across the country in a train in a matter of hours. So, yeah, we'll see some more train investment, but don't expect our country to be blown over and suddenly have all this train travel, because just look at the experience in California. They've been investing a ton of money in train travel, and they've been extremely unsuccessful.
We did get a question through the chat, and since I'd invited those, I want to take this one. This is addressed to Brad. Brad mentioned a concern about the velocity of money with the individual cash payments sitting in bank accounts. My question is, what do you predict to see as a result of hundreds of billions of dollars entering our fractional reserve banking system? Should we expect banks to be loaning out mass sums of money?
So great question. Yeah. So a lot of this money has kind of stuck in bank accounts. And so, you have to think about, how do banks make money? They make money on the difference between, the amount that they're getting from lending the money compared to the interest that they're paying on the deposits that are sitting there. And so no bank or no credit union wants to be taking in a bunch of money and just keeping it sit there, because they're paying interest on the deposit. And they're not making any money, and they have, all sorts of administrative costs that they need to incur and things like that. Okay, so this money comes in, it needs to be lent out, and that's where the problem is that we're in a situation where in the banking sector we've had this huge increase in deposits, but it's at a time when the economy is not going gangbusters. And so banks and credit unions have to lend it out, or else they're losing money on the deposits. And so, they need to find investments, or they need to find loans to use them on. And so, we've seen this incredible decrease in interest rates kind of across the board. If you look at home loans right now, they're at just ridiculously low levels. So, a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, I checked earlier today, and it was something like 2.7%. That's absolutely unheard of how low that is. And the reason why is that we have all this money that's chasing, some use for it. Interest rates end up being driven down, and that can have, negative downstream impacts. The last time we had a housing bubble, something similar happened, where interest rates were very low, house prices started being bid up, because people saw monthly payments were very low. There were all sorts of other things going on at the same time too, but this was one of the ingredients, very low interest rates that led to people, taking out, mortgages and bidding up houses because the monthly payments wouldn't be so high. And that, and that process seems to have started to take off a little bit. If we look at, year over year housing appreciation of something like 9% the past year, which you wouldn't expect during a pandemic, and during a pretty steep recession, but that's what's been happening. So, so I think there are going to be some economic kind of follow-on effects that come out of this.
Let's go to Xavier or Kyle's room.
Yeah, hi, my name's Kyle Seibert. I just had a question kind of on the minimum wage that we talked about earlier. I think we probably answered most of it, but I was just sort of thinking, do you believe that the Senate really kind of has what it takes to overrule the parliamentarian in the event that he or she would throw out a $15 minimum wage increase through reconciliation? Or do you think that they would probably just listen to the advice of the parliamentarian on that?
Well, I'll just throw in that the interesting thing is they may use the parliamentarian as a crutch, actually, because you've got some real moderate Democrats who aren't so thrilled about the $15 minimum wage either. And that's because while some cities can afford the $15 minimum wage, a lot of rural areas, it's a proportionally a much bigger burden, and the cost of living is not as high as it would be in San Francisco. And a lot of cities have already passed a minimum wage of $15, right? So the impact's going to be in the cities that haven't passed a $15 minimum wage, and then rural areas that are closer to the current federal minimum wage. So your question is, I think I'm going to redirect your question and say the Democrats may be thrilled to have the parliamentarian throw it out, because again, they only need 50 votes, but they still have some more moderate Democrats that are going to be uncomfortable with that $15 minimum wage. So they may use it as, let's blame it on the parliamentarian and happily not ask, Senator Manchin and some of these other moderate Democrats to have to take a vote on it. Brad, sorry if I jumped ahead of you.
No, I agree with that completely. So kind of going back to when the Affordable Care Act was passed, there was an example where, they used reconciliation to get part of a legislative agenda kind of through the door, but they could only do the pieces that were kind of valid under reconciliation. And so they got that passed. And then, once that was done, then they followed up with another bill that, kind of filled in the pieces that they couldn't do through reconciliation. That's the kind of thing that you can do with a behemoth bill like the Affordable Care Act. Something as simple as the $15 minimum wage, it's hard to, chunk it up like that to get the piece through the door that you can get through the door, and then because there really isn't a way to separate it like that.
Yeah. And I'd say too that if you're listening to the business leaders in the United States, a lot of the large business leaders are basically saying they're not opposed to a significant increase in the minimum wage. It's the smaller companies though that are that don't have as strong a voice because they're they're just they're going to have a bigger hit.
Colby, I'm sorry we ran out of time. I don't want to keep our speakers any longer, but let's give a round of applause to Donna McLean and Brad Heim. Great discussion, I thought, today. Thank you very much.